boys and girls. Hope you're keeping well. We miss you at Sunday school, and it's all a bit strange doing Sunday school online, but we hope you enjoy Sunday school the way we're doing it at the minute, and hopefully it'll not be too long before we're back at church. And as soon as we can get back into the church building, we look forward to seeing you all there. Today I'm going to tell you a story, and there's a couple of things in it that I want to teach you about, and that's fear and obedience. So I wonder, is there anything that you're scared of? Can you think of anything? Some things are a bit silly that you're scared of, or that I'm scared of. One of the things I'm scared of are daddy long legs. I don't really like spiders very much, but daddy long legs really scare me. They're like flying spiders. But that's a sort of a silly thing to be scared of. Other things that I'm scared of are maybe heights, being up somewhere very, very high. My legs turn to jelly and my stomach feels all funny. And that really does scare me. And it's not a very nice feeling, having a feeling of fear and being scared like that. So it's a horrible feeling. So it's this story this morning teaches us a wee bit about fear and also obedience to God. So I'm going to see if you can guess the story that I'm going to speak about today. So I'm going to show you a few things that I've printed off, a few photos that I've printed off, or pictures, and see if you can guess what the story is going to be about today. Okay, let's have a wee look. So some of them are pictures of the mammal in real life, and some are like cartoon. That one there maybe gives you a wee bit of a clue, that picture. And some of these you can actually see in this country. Whenever we were in Portstewart in August, we saw some of these out in the sea. That's a big clue, that one. Maybe some of you have already guessed what the story's going to be about. That one there is the biggest clue, isn't it? Have some of you guessed? Do some of you know what the story's going to be about? Well, if you have, the story is about Jonah. So I'm going to go through the story, and you're going to see different pictures, and then I'll speak to you at the end again. Okay?
Jonah was a Hebrew prophet who lived in the land of Israel a long time ago. God used him to deliver important messages to the Israelites. Sometimes these messages were warnings. Other times, God gave Jonah good news to share. You might think Jonah was very holy to be used by God, but he was just like us. He didn't always behave how God wanted him to behave. During this time, the king of Israel was a very rich and wicked king. He built huge palaces instead of helping the poor, and he worshipped false gods. Despite this, God still loved the people of Israel. One day, God gave Jonah a message for the king. Tell the king that Israel will conquer its enemies. He will win back the land that was stolen, and Israel will become a mighty nation. Jonah swallowed hard and stared at the ground. The thought of giving the king a message from God gave him goosebumps. What if it didn't come true? The king might throw him in jail for the rest of his life, or even worse, kill him. The next morning, Jonah put on his finest tunic and dashed through the busy streets to the royal palace. He marched up the steps and bowed before the king. "Your Majesty, I have a message from God," said Jonah. "What is it?" snapped the king. He scowled at Jonah from his large golden throne. He didn't like prophets with messages from God. They usually told him things he didn't want to hear. "Go and fight the Assyrians," Jonah told him. "God will give you victory over your enemies, and you'll become a powerful king." The king smiled. He liked the idea of becoming a great king. Later that week, the king gathered all his horses, chariots and soldiers and marched out to fight the powerful Assyrians. He captured the city of Damascus and won back the land that belonged to the people of Israel. Jonah breathed a sigh of relief. Phew! God's message had come true. Being a prophet was much easier when God had good news to share. God had another job planned for Jonah. One day, while Jonah prayed under an olive tree, God said to him, "Jonah, I want you to go to the city of Nineveh." Jonah frowned. He didn't like the sound of that idea at all. No one liked the Assyrians. "If I go to Assyria, the Ninevites will kill me," said Jonah. He wiped the sweat from his brow. Why would God send me there? God ignored Jonah's protests. "Tell the Ninevites that they are a wicked people." Jonah wasn't keen on telling the Ninevites anything. Why couldn't God just punish them for being wicked? He sat under the olive tree and stared grimly into the distance. "What if the Ninevites repent?" Jonah said. He knew that God was a God of both judgment and mercy. I could look like a fool and Israel might not become a great nation. Jonah's thoughts and fears consumed him. He came up with a silly plan. He decided to ignore God's instructions and escape to a land far away. That night Jonah grabbed his satchel and fled to the city of Joppa. Joppa's harbour was full of ships, and Jonah knew he could find one that would take him far away from Nineveh. "I wonder if there's a boat leaving today," he thought. At the end of the pier he spotted a ship bound for Tarshish. Tarshish was as far from Nineveh as he could get. He hurried over and introduced himself to the captain. "Do you have space for one more?" asked Jonah. The captain laughed greedily and nodded. 10 silver coins, he said. Jonah paid for his ticket and scurried up the gangplank. His head bowed. He knew God was not pleased with this plan. Soon the sailors were ready to leave for Tarshish. Jonah was relieved. Maybe he could get away from God after all. But God still knew that what Jonah was up to. As the ship crept across the Mediterranean Sea, God sent a violent storm. Winds roared through the sails like a tornado, and waves pounded the sides of the ship. "The boat will break into pieces, and we'll drown," shouted the sailors. "What have we done to deserve this?" Every sailor cried out to his own God to save them, but the seas grew higher and higher. The captain stood in the middle of the ship, his arms wrapped tightly around the mast. "Throw some of the cargo overboard," he shouted. "The ship will be easier to control." The sailors did as the captain commanded, but it made no difference. Meanwhile, the captain opened the wooden latch and peered into the dark hold. He couldn't believe his eyes. Jonah lay fast asleep, snoring like a baby. "Jonah, how can you sleep?" yelled the captain. "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he'll feel sorry for us and save our lives." Up on the deck, the sailors were ready to start pointing fingers. They said to each other, "Let's draw straws and find out who's to blame for this storm." They drew Jonah's name and glared at him. "Why is this storm tormenting us?" they asked. "What are you doing here anyway? Where are you from?" "I'm a Hebrew," Jonah answered. "I serve God, the God of heaven. He created both the land and the sea." The sailors trembled with fear. They had heard all about the mighty God of the Hebrews. "This horrible storm is all my fault," continued Jonah. He hung his head in shame. "If I had listened to God, we wouldn't be in this mess." "Well, what can we do to stop the storm?" the sailors asked him. Jonah knew God was a just God and would save the sailors' lives. "If you toss me into the sea, the storm will disappear," he said. The sailors liked Jonah. They didn't want to throw him overboard. Instead, they rowed harder and harder towards the shore, but the seas grew rougher and higher. Finally, the sailors cried out to God, "Please don't punish us for taking this man's life." They grabbed Jonah by the arms and legs and they tossed him into the crashing waves. The sea instantly became as still as glass. The ship was saved. God wasn't ready to let Jonah die. As the runaway prophet tumbled towards the bottom of the ocean, God sent an enormous fish to swallow him up. The fish liked this idea. He was hungry. It opened its jaws as wide as possible, sucking Jonah into its enormous mouth. Jonah slid across its slimy pink tongue and nosedived into its dark, empty belly. It was steamy, sticky, and black as midnight. Jonah stood up and opened his eyes. He could not even see a single thing. His heart quaked with fear, and he fell to his knees and wept. For 3 days and 3 nights Jonah lived inside the enormous fish. It was the longest 3 days of his life. Jonah wished he had obeyed God. He prayed like he had never prayed before. Finally, God told the fish to spit Jonah out of its dark, steamy belly. The fish opened its mouth and spat Jonah out. Jonah flew through the air like a spear and landed with a thump on the white sandy beach. He was near enemy territory now, but he didn't care. He was ready to obey God. Jonah never wanted to live inside a fish again. Jonah lay sprawled on the beach like a starfish, covered in fish slime and sand. He was finally ready to listen to God. "Jonah, get up and go to the city of Nineveh," said God. "Tell the people to repent." Jonah jumped to his feet. He ran down to the water's edge. He washed his tunic in the calm blue sea. Then he set off to Nineveh as fast as his legs would carry him. A few days later, Jonah arrived at the gates of Nineveh. "Where do I start?" wondered Jonah. He scratched his beard. The city walls stretched as far as the eye could see. He hadn't realised Nineveh was this big. Jonah took a deep breath. He knew it was time to give the people God's message. "In 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown," shouted Jonah. He walked from one side of the city to the other. "Repent and turn to God's ways." The Ninevites peered out of their houses and listened carefully. Much to Jonah's dismay, they believed God's message and wanted to stop their bad behaviour. Tearing off their clothes, they put on sackcloth to show that they had repented. When the king of Nineveh heard Jonah's message, he leapt from his throne, tore his fine robes and put on sackcloth. Then he plunked himself down in a pile of ashes. It might be hard to imagine a king getting so scared, but he had heard all about this mighty God of the Hebrews. Later that day, the king rose to his feet and made an announcement to his people. "No person or animal is to eat or drink anything," he said. "Everyone must wear sackcloth, pray to the God of the Hebrews and give up their wicked behaviour." When God saw that the Ninevites had given up their evil ways, he decided not to punish them. The people of Nineveh were relieved. But Jonah was not happy. He wanted God to destroy Nineveh. If God let Israel's enemies live, the Israelites would never become a great nation. "God, didn't I say this would happen?" moaned Jonah. "I knew you'd forgive the Ninevites if they repented. Now people will think I'm a fool. Why did you just let me die?" "What right do you have to be angry?" replied God. Jonah didn't have an answer. He turned his back on Nineveh and marched out of the city gates to the hill overlooking the city. Using branches, he made himself a shelter and waited to see what would happen next. Maybe God will change his mind and destroy Nineveh, he thought. God decided to teach Jonah a lesson. He made a plant grow to protect Jonah from the blazing sun. Jonah stretched out in the shade and smiled. This is more like it, he thought. But at dawn the next day, a worm attacked the plant. Its leaves shriveled up until there was nothing left. The sun beat down on Jonah's head until he nearly fainted. "God, I can't stand this heat any longer," moaned Jonah. "It's hotter than a volcano. I'd be better off dead. Just let me die." "Do you have a right to be so angry about the plant?" asked God. "Yes, I have every right to be angry," said Jonah. "I'm angry enough to die." "The plant grew in one day and disappeared the next," said God. "You didn't make it grow, yet you're still upset it's gone. I made all the people of Nineveh, from the old grandparents to all the little children. Don't I have a right to be concerned about them? After all, the people don't know what they're doing." Jonah bit his lip and stared at the dusty ground. He knew God was right, and from that day onwards he decided to never disobey God again.
So I hope you enjoyed the story of Jonah, and it teaches us that we cannot run away from God, isn't that right? And whenever we have fear or we're being disobedient, we need to turn to Him. God doesn't want us to be fearful, and He doesn't want us to be disobedient either. So it's really important that we trust in God and look to Him whenever we're going through times of fear, or if we're being disobedient and we know we've done something wrong, we can speak to Him and ask Him to forgive us. So I hope you enjoyed that wee story. Now I've got a challenge for you for next week. If you could send in photographs of maybe doing this challenge. Not sure if you can see it very well, but I drew and cut out a whale. I'm not very good at art, so you could do an awful lot better than that, I'm sure. And you could be more creative. You can do a whale or a big fish, or you can do the mouth open and Jonah coming out of the whale or going in. It's up to you, but I thought it'd be a nice wee challenge to do that and send your photograph in, and we'll get it up on the website. Okay, so see you next week. Bye bye.